All right. This is Clark, and today I'm going to talk about the Winter War, which was fought between 1939 and 1940 between the USSR and Finland. And Russia sought to neutralize Finland, while Finland wanted to retain independence. So, gearing up for the war in the 1930s, international tensions were on the rise throughout Europe. And because of this, Finland was expanding its military. They had an officer training corps that led to 180,000 soldiers, or a mandatory training program that led to 180,000 soldiers and officers being trained. And they also built the Mannerheim Line, which was a line of defenses between the Gulf of Finland and Lake Ladoga that was near the border of the Soviet Union. And this was very well fortified. It was 150 kilometers long. And Joseph Stalin, who was the Soviet leader at the time, um, considered Finland's proximity to St. Petersburg, Leningrad, a threat. It was only about 100 kilometers away from the border. And he believed that a German attack, if Finland didn't remain neutral, could move through Finland, and the proximity to Leningrad would be an issue for the Soviets. Um, so, um, because of this, Russia began building railway tracks towards the Finnish border as they needed allies. They started building railway tracks towards the Finnish border in case they needed to fight Finland, and they also needed allies at the time. Um, it was right after the Great Purge, and Russia was reorganizing. And that's the Great Purge was where Stalin executed his political rivals and consolidated power. But he needed recognition of this power internationally, and the USSR also needed allies if there was going to be a global conflict breaking out. So he went to the UK and France initially, but they rejected his offer for a treat or a alliance, and so he turned towards Germany, and they signed a non-aggression pact. And although the non-aggression pact didn't really stop conflict between Germany and Russia, the main implications for this conflict between Finland and Russia were the clauses of the agreement that divide Europe into spheres of influence. And so, according to this, Russia would get Finland and other Baltic states like Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia. But Finland was worried about this agreement because um, they didn't want to be influenced by Russia. And so they pushed to form the Norwegian alliance, where a large Swedish army that they hopefully would partner with would be able to deter attacks from Germany or the USSR. However, when Sweden caved in to Soviet and German demands, um, Finland was kind of on its own, and had to go it alone. And so when World War II begins in the East, Germany and Russia invade Poland, and Stalin demands that the Baltic states allow military access, and Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania agree, but Finland does not. And they actually intensify fortification of the Mannerheim Line. And when the USSR and Finland try to negotiate, those negotiations fall through in November of 1939. And so Russia decides to provoke a war in order to, with the idea that they wanted to stop Germany from using them as a military base and establish their own military base near the Finnish capital of Helsinki. And so they wanted to also destroy all fortifications on the Karelian Isthmus in order to allow their troops to pass through. So they renounced the Russia-Finnish non-aggression pact, and before that, they staged a false flag attack on a Soviet border post, and this is called the Shelling of Manila. And then after that, they blame Finland, and they renounced their non-aggression pact, and that's when the war began. And so, in the early stages of the war, Russia lacked a lot of intelligence on the extent of the defenses on the Mannerheim Line, and they believed they'd be able to take Helsinki, the capital, in about 3 weeks. And they also spread an army north to attack northern Finland along the border and prevent any support from Norway in the Barents Sea. Now, Finland was clearly pretty outnumbered in this war. You can see from the stats they did not have the army that the USSR was putting towards this conflict. And even though they had 500 artillery units, they lacked a lot of ammo for that. So Finland was kind of on the back foot in this conflict, and they were going to have to fight to defend their country. So on November 30th, Russia launched a surprise attack on Finland, but because the Mannerheim Line was built behind the border a bit, a heavily outnumbered Finnish border guard was able to hold the Soviet ground assault for 7 days. And this allowed other Finnish divisions to respond and get into position on the line. And Finland correctly identified the places where they thought the Soviet Union would attack, and they redistributed their artillery accordingly in order to economically use that artillery to repel the initial assault. And so some Finnish tactics that were used throughout the war. In the east, Finnish troops enacted a fighting retreat where they would cede ground to the Soviets, but they would continue to harass them, cut off supply lines, try and seize equipment. And this cost the Soviets a ton of casualties compared to the losses that the Finns faced. So this was definitely working. And this also allowed for strategic counterattacks at Soviet weak points when they presented themselves. Finnish forces also fought a guerrilla warfare in the north where they were heavily outnumbered. And those strategies required a low amount of troops compared to the amount of resources that Finland was putting into the Mannerheim line in the south. And the Finnish army believed they could defend this position for about 6 months while they waited for support from other countries like the UK or France. And I can't show many battles, but one battle that I wanted to highlight was the Battle of Suomussalmi. And this was where Soviet forces crossed the eastern border, as you can see in red, and they hoped to capture the city of Oulu. And this area was only defended by one Finnish battalion near the village of Suomussalmi. And the significance of this is that the Russians wanted to cut Finland in half and isolate forces on either side. And so it was really important that the Finns were able to defend this. So the outnumbered Finns, realizing that they weren't going to be able to defeat the Soviets in a straight attack, retreated to the forests and allowed the Soviets to take the village. However, the Finnish forces had destroyed the town before they got there, so they didn't have any resources or places to take shelter within the village. And so the Battle of Suomussalmi, the Finns regrouped, and they severed communication lines and cut off the supply routes for the Soviets. So they didn't take a direct attack to attacking them, but they isolated the force first and hoped to deplete their resources. And so obviously this prompted a heavy Soviet reinforcements from the east. 14,000 soldiers were brought in along the road. You can see there to the right. I think it's the Rata Road. However, a small force of 350 Finns was actually able to stop that Soviet advance by harassing them from the sides, as you can see there. And so the Finnish soldiers were able to encircle Suomussalmi and take the town since it was isolated from Soviet reinforcements. And then the Soviet reinforcements started to starve, and the Finnish troops utilized a tactic called Modi, where they isolate each individual part of the force and attack it one by one in order to seize a ton of equipment. And they did seize a ton of equipment, which was really helpful. There were at least 7,000 Russian casualties in this attack. They seized 43 tanks, 29 anti-tank guns, 300 machine guns, 6,000 rifles, and it was the largest loss of the Winter War for the Soviets. And this victory boosted morale, and it definitely gave the Finns hope that they were able to defend their country from Russia. And even though it was a major success, there were a lot of losses for the USSR, and it was not all great for them. So the USSR had taken the coastal port city of Petsamo, which had isolated Finland from its northern ports to be able to reach the sea. And in January, the Soviet military actually started to reduce some reforms. So they started screening their attacks with heavy artillery and armor, and they shifted their focus to the southeast on the Karelian Isthmus, which is where the Mannerheim line was. And so there's increasing pressure on Finland at this time. By February, the Soviets had deployed about 460,000 soldiers to the area and 3,350 artillery pieces. And opposing them, the Finns only had about 150,000 soldiers down there. And so the USSR deployed a heavy shelling campaign, and eventually, one by one, Finnish strongholds were taken by the Soviet attacks. So the Finns were forced to retreat, and after months of fighting, Red soldiers were able to break through the Mannerheim line. And so they were able to capture the city of Viipuri, which is actually the second largest city in Finland at the time. So this is one of the factors leading to peace negotiations after that. Finnish forces were rapidly approaching exhaustion, ammunition and supplies were low, and there was a high Soviet casualty rate. So both sides had reasons to get out of this war. The USSR obviously was kind of a political embarrassment to be held up so much by Finland and to have so many losses. And they thought that it might get worse if they waited till spring when all the snow thawed out. And the USSR also had an overestimated belief that France and Britain would intervene, so they needed to divert their resources other places, and they decided to negotiate. And on the 12th of February, the Finnish foreign minister arrived in Stockholm, and he negotiated the peace terms with the Soviets through the Swedes. However, they were disappointed to see that Stalin wasn't present. They kind of thought it was disrespectful. And the Moscow Peace Treaty was signed on the 12th of March in 1940. And a ceasefire took effect the next day at 11 a.m. Helsinki time. So the outcome of this war, you can see the regions in red were the regions ceded to the USSR. They took the Karelian Isthmus and a portion of Karelia, which is up north, and some of the land north of Lake Ladoga. However, most of the industrialized territory was still held by Finland's military, and despite gains, the war was an embarrassment to the Russian military. The Russians had 160,000 soldiers dead and 200,000 wounded, compared to much smaller losses by the Finns. Now, the impact on World War II is a political success for the Germans. The USSR's performance really exposed the Red Army's weaknesses, and it convinced Hitler that an invasion of the USSR would probably be successful. And in June 1941, Hitler declared, "We only have to kick in the door, and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down." And here are my works cited.